So, toilets and human waste are some of those things that we're actually quite, well, I don't know, shy about talking to, which is really curious to my mind because, of course, it's an essential biological function and part of what we are as human beings, but the attitude to it is rooted really in our history. I mean, when we were all just tribes or little villagers, the biggest problem you had was finding a log to perch on that was far enough away, and that was a fine solution. Basically, dump it and leave it. Presumably, that's where the phrase comes from. But as we gathered together more in towns, of course, it became much more of an issue. And so it was a long walk to an appropriate log, special areas were set up, and they were the origin of the cesspit. But as you continue to grow, that kind of system doesn't become applicable anymore. And of course, ancient Rome at its height had a population of over 1 million people. 1 million people crammed into that little area led to those things that we know the Romans of. The water and sewage management system in Rome was just incredible. Of course, everybody remembers things like the aqueduct along the Appian Way, but nobody really remembers the stunning things that the Romans did with their sewage system, because the Romans also did something else. They recognized that this waste was a fundamental resource, and they separated it out. Urine was used for bleaching and washing linen because it's nothing better than fresh urine for doing something like that. They also used it for brushing their teeth because it's a tooth whitener, and there was a urine tax. So they were using the resource and separating it, as well as creating a marvellous system for actually getting rid of it. But of course, that didn't really last, because when Rome fell and everything was decentralised, we all went back to living in small villages and tiny towns, and our attitude to the problem was, again, just find some way you can chuck it and ignore it. And of course, that continued to be the attitude to the problem until about 1858. During the Industrial Revolution, people were cramming themselves into towns in the tune of millions. And of course, millions of people produce a mighty mountain of waste. Nobody did anything. It piled up in the streets, it piled up at the end of houses, it was chucked in the river, and in 1858 we got in London what's called the Great Stink. The Great Stink was so bad that the Houses of Parliament couldn't sit because it was next to the River Thames and it stank to high heaven. And what they did was call in the services of Joseph Bazalgette, who began his sewers. The sewers, which were built in that period of time, are still standing, are still used, and are still a marvel of engineering. But they constituted really taking all of that waste and shipping it upstream when it was actually chucked into the environment, because it still wasn't really that much of an issue. The issue was it being too near to you, because of course human waste is a vector for disease. It's mostly bacteria, viruses, protozoa and worms. And the biggest way of treating it is essentially just to leave it alone. You leave it alone and chuck in a few chemicals, everything there will die. But it takes time for it to die. And if you put it in a big heap and stick your fingers in a day or two, then you're in trouble. And of course, outbreaks of cholera were very common. So it needed put somewhere where it could be treated a little bit, given a bit of time, and then got rid of. And pretty much that is what sludge treatment works, and sludge treatment lakes and bogs are all about. Septic tanks are very similar in their procedures there to make this stuff harmless so that you can basically chuck it away, because it is a tremendous fertiliser as long as you don't concentrate those disease-bearing pathogens. You get rid of them, then you have something that may stink a little bit, may look not look very nice, but is actually tremendously useful. Our attitudes, current modern attitudes in the developed world, really stem back to those Victorian times. And of course it was in 1880 when Thomas Crapper improved the U-bend, so much so there was actually, I think it was shortlisted for one of the 50th great inventions in the entire world that created the modern economy. And of course it also created that attitude of flush, forget. And it's the attitude we continue to have on the whole today in what we call the developed world. Of course, to a degree, it's actually just a problem of numbers. I mean, there is estimated something like 8 billion of us in the world. It has to be an estimate because there's one child born every second. By the time you finish counting, there's at least another 100 million. So It's about 8 billion or so. Everybody taking a dump once a day. That's a lot of waste, and that is being recognised within the sewage treatment industry because they no longer talk about this as waste effluent. They now call it resource flow, which I think is just awesome because it changes that mindset from something we can flush and forget, something we must throw away, something that is smelly and horrible, into something that is potentially valuable. Now, of course, this is well recognised through history. For in the Middle Ages, then the urine collectors were abundant. They would go around collecting pee because it could be turned into gunpowder, the gold of the time. These days, when you look at something like Africa, then the amount of human excreta created in Africa is estimated to be greater than the total amount of fertiliser used in the entire continent, and we're just throwing it away. Now, there are a number of ways of dealing with human waste besides the sewage system. Kenya, for instance, has a company called Sanivation. And what they do is supply the local population with blue buckets that they use. These are collected and taken by Sanivation to a centralised point where they use the sun to dry that material and cure that material into briquettes that have a higher calorific value than wood. That's then resold and becomes a cooking fuel. Another great example of this is a prison in Rwanda. There they collect the faeces from the prison inmates and basically use a biodigester. Essentially they stick it in a tank, let it brew, it gives off methane as the bacteria digests all that waste. That methane is then burnt as a fuel. I have a friend who's working on exactly that, but at a home scale, so he can generate his own methane from his own waste, and I think he uses garden waste and food waste as well, at that kind of level. So it's very adaptable as well as being predominant in the area. And it's also, I think, to a degree, one of the areas where Africa is leading the world. Of course, if putting a lot of effort into something is not what you're into, then there is a version available called the composting toilet. The composting toilet actually is not very much more than a box full of sawdust. You poop in it, chuck a bit more sawdust or organic matter like straw over it, it creates an aerobic condition and the bacteria and fungi will break that down and kill the pathogens in it, so what you're left with is a usable compost. There's another variant of that called a vermiculite toilet, which is what it sounds like. It's got vermiculite in, you chuck a bit of water in there as well, and the earthworms come along and help promote that decomposition. But there you're doing very little more than chucking in a handful of sawdust every now and then. And you find that kind of toilet in things like national parks, EV stations, off-grid homes, and in rural areas where you're not able to connect to a septic tank or have a sewage sludge delivery service for you. So if that's not for you, I mean, for space reasons, for example, you live on a boat or something like that, then there is something available called an incinerating toilet, and it does what it says on the box. It basically turns all that waste into a teaspoon of ash by burning it, incinerating it. And of course they've got such filters on that it's not a smelly option. You end up with this little teaspoon from per person per day or something. The figures are available anyway, and it's around about a cupful of ash for a family of 4 every couple of days or so. So of course that waste has been concentrated down now to a nutrient-rich ash that can be used, but probably is just thrown away. Now we've been talking about those kind of point of collection ideas, dealing with it where it's generated. I mean, it's been a hint of centralised stuff with things like Sanivation, but mostly it's all about dealing with it when it's there at that point. And when you have specific points like prisons, it makes it all a bit more easy, but deal with it on point. Now, of course, we have that other option because, of course, we have a centralised system. We collect all that stuff from the different toilets through the sewage system and it goes to a central point where it's all being dealt with. As I mentioned, human sewage contains a ton of fixed nitrogen, an awful lot of phosphates as well as organic materials, and you've got to give it to the Americans. Where there's a business and a profit, they'll create a business and a profit, and the Milwaukee Municipal Treatment Works turned their treatment sewage sludge into a branded product called Milorganite, which is sold on the market currently. Okay, so I've been rambling on for a bit, but what's my point? Well, because there are so many of us, sewage is no longer something we can leave as an open problem. chuck it away and forget about it. And it's something we've got to close the loop on. And there are two options really. We can do that either locally through things like composting toilets or biodigesters or a whole range of other things, or we can do it centrally where we're doing things like creating fertilizers or creating better fuels that can then be used. Whichever we decide to do, it certainly has to be a problem that we look at closing the loop on, even though we don't actually like to look at it. And don't forget, 26.7% of the water we use goes straight down the toilet. That's about 13,000 gallons per year per person per toilet. That idea of not talking about it itself is a new concept. The Roman toilet, for instance, was a long bench where everybody would go down and sit and have a chat with their mate, pay a couple of sesterces for a rag on a stick to give themselves a wash afterwards, and that was it. It was the invention of the water closet that made us all go into those little rooms and avoid talking about the whole situation. So perhaps that attitude, really, which is not very old, has seen its day. Perhaps it's something we should be talking about and should be thinking about a bit more to help close that loop on something that is becoming quite a growing issue. And of course we're going beyond human waste here as well to think about agricultural waste. Did you know there are 7 chickens for every person? That's a huge number of chickens and a huge amount of ammonia that's actually produced and just dumped, and the same for cows and the same for sheep. So that idea of closing the loop on sewage stretches beyond us to every aspect of what it is that we do when we come to farming and agriculture and human habitation. Anyway, I just wanted to make you aware of this and that there were a ton of really interesting things being done, particularly in Africa. And I hope it inspires you to have a look and have a think about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to like and subscribe, because subscribing really does help.